And today, the title of our event is How AI is Helping Tackle COVID-19. And with us, we have two brilliant people, John and Albert, and they're going to tell us about some of the technology that they have used to detect COVID in patients and how they've used AI to detect COVID. So it's going to be an exciting talk. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing about how this works and how this can help people. So thank you so much, both of you, for being here. So I'll just turn it over to you. So John and Albert, if you can introduce yourselves a little bit, that'd be awesome.
Sure. Albert, do you want to go first and maybe share a screen?
Yeah, sure. I'm Albert Hsiao. I'm a radiologist at UCSD and a co-founder of Arterys. I started as faculty here about 6.5 years ago, and started with John at Arterys way back when I was still a resident in training up at Stanford. Yeah, happy to be here, happy to talk about what we've been able to do with AI and help to manage our COVID patients.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm John Axerio-Cilies, and I'm the CEO and co-founder here at Arterys. My background is on the computational engineering side. So I love events like this where I can get into the technical details, but over the past 10 years, I've been in the medical imaging space, wearing multiple hats, kind of product hats, clinical hats, and now we're on the operations and commercial side as well. So very happy to be here.
Awesome. So I'll let you guys share screen. So please go ahead, share your presentation. The format is going to be, we're going to have a presentation for about 45 minutes. People can put out their questions as Albert and John present, but in the very end, we'll have about like 5 minutes where we can ask questions. We can have a discussion around various things that they've presented. All right. So it's all yours, guys.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And if you go to the next slide, Albert, I want to just start off with a little introduction to Arterys and give some context as to how we're helping with the COVID-19 effort. So Arterys is at a point now where we have developed kind of our own clinical applications, but we've really opened up the platform to be able to support what I refer to as third-party applications. And these are third-party applications created by industry, but also academia. And we want to be able to support kind of the clinical adoption of these models that really start off as AI models, but over time we wanted them to be clinical applications with all the kind of the infrastructure around them to make them be as clinically useful as possible, with minimal intrusion into the workflow, which is critical. So what's an interesting use case that we'll show today is that with the platform we can also deploy certain, like in the case of Albert at UCSD, he can deploy his algorithm to within his health system only, and get adoption, get usage, and then from there grow in a fashion that he can control. So it's kind of from the health system led. And then on the flip side, we also have partners that want to deploy their algorithms on the platform and have that be globally accessible by all of our install base. So that's also flexible. So we've basically developed the platform to be able to do kind of any AI integration and integrate it into that clinical workflow, which is critical. So it's not just having that AI result. That's just 5% of the problem. The other 95% is political. It's driven by ROI. Driven by UI, UX, driven by like clinical evidence, how it's truly impacting patients downstream. That's what truly matters. If you go to the next slide. So in terms of how we try to integrate these AI solutions into this clinical workflow, and we'll talk about how we do it specifically for COVID, but I wanted to give this slide a quick overview of kind of what our stack looks like in order to achieve this. So at the base, we have kind of a layer around security and privacy, where we actually de-identify the data, and the entire stack is actually cloud hosted. So the data is actually emanating from the scanners and going up into our cloud. It's being processed. We run inference, and then the results can be viewed within our viewer or sent back into specific systems at the hospital. So it starts with that security privacy layer. We also have all the integrations, whether it's DICOM, HL7, or RESTful APIs to be able to push and pull information. Above that, we run off of AWS. We have multiple regions around the world, and then lastly, we have that viewer experience where we can bring in that AI into a UI and user experience that's as minimal from a click perspective and as tightly integrated into that user's cockpit as possible. And we'll show you kind of how we do that. But what we try to do, for example, is we URL launch from whatever worklist solution they have, so that they can have the result in context for that patient without having to sign on or sign up for any additional context. And there's a lot of integration things that we do just to make it super seamless. If you go to the next slide. So I wanted to highlight a couple different models that we brought on from third parties on our marketplace. So if you go to the next slide, one of them is a partner that we brought on called Arterys. They had an algorithm that detects pneumonia on chest CTs. And in this case, in just a few days, we were able to integrate that model through a Docker container. And when we actually have customers in Europe using this on a routine basis to kind of triage their patients. So this is kind of an output of what it looks like, but it's essentially trying to quantify pneumonia in each of the lobes, and we kind of color the regions accordingly. If you go to the next slide, Albert, just have some metrics around what we've done for in this particular case. So what they're using the algorithm for is I identify recovery patterns in patients specific to COVID. So they kind of track these patients over time from the 0, 2 weeks, 1.5, 3 months, 6 months later, and seeing what the progression looks like and what the patterns of recovery look like. Also, they're able to use this tool as a way just to quantify these acute cases at patient admission and better triage them, which is a interesting use case. But again, it's still early days, and I'm sure Albert will go into how clinically this information is useful. It's not really used as a detection mechanism because it's for a variety of different reasons, but it is a good tool to be able to quantify the extent of the disease and track patients across time. If you go to the next slide. This is another model that we've integrated from a third party. So not specific to COVID-19, but in this case, it's flagging 7 different pathology. This is a screenshot on the left of how that information is shown for that user in terms of not only kind of a bounding box of where we think that pathology is, but also an error estimate or a confidence interval is also something important or nice to provide, because that gives some users some confidence as to like how confident we are or the AI is in that result. Because sometimes it can be quite misleading if you place a bounding box saying this is a collapsed lung or pneumothorax or whatever it is, and you don't give any confidence. It's a challenge from the end user perspective to interpret that, especially if they don't see it. If you go to the next slide. So this just gives you some numbers around the accuracy of the model, every pathology has kind of a different different performance, and those are listed there. But in this case, we trained over 40,000 fully annotated X-rays, and the goal is to bring on even more pathology. So this producer mildew is adding more pathology, and actively working on it on a daily basis. And with the great thing about this cloud deployment model is that every user has the latest and greatest information. So they just refresh their browser and they get updates to the model, which is really great and a kind of a differentiator compared to how traditional software is deployed in hospitals. If you go to the next slide. So this just kind of shows you some of the features that we've done on the X-ray side in terms of work list flags. So flagging certain pathology right at the work list, or we basically can also send secondary captures back into the packs, which Albert will show. But there's a few different features here that is specific to the X-ray product. That's actually a commercial product that's sold in Europe. And what Albert will show is more for research use only, but hopefully one day will become a clinical product, because we don't think COVID is going to go away anytime soon. If you go to the next slide.
Hold on real quick, John. Pawan, does it make sense? There's a question we got in the Q&A there.
Yeah, so let me just sort of ask that question. For the pneumonia triage, is the model used intended for severity detection, since it's not used for confirmation? That is a question.
Yeah, Albert?
Yeah, I mean, we'll go into some of the algorithms that we've developed in the lab in a little bit, but I think it is important. This does touch on a really important question: is what are you designing the algorithm for? What is the purpose? Is it for detection? Is it for diagnosis? Is it for quantification? Is it for what aspect of the patient's clinical care? And there are dimensions that are outside of the algorithm itself, like how is the imaging modality being used? So if it's quantifying the amount of pneumonia or severity of pneumonia on CT, then that use case is dependent on how CT is being used, right? So if CT is being used to follow patients over time in certain countries, then that's a possibility. But in the US, we don't do that. For example, like we don't do CTs at 3 months, 6 months, or as part of our clinical routine. So that wouldn't be a good use case in the United States. But in China, they are doing that, and certain parts of Europe, they're doing that. So then that would be a good application of that algorithm.
So is there any sort of survival analysis that you do as you follow them over time? Because I'm sure there's some drop off and there's some.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you can do these kinds of analyses. I don't remember if I put that into the slides of one of the slides that I'll be presenting a little bit, but we do that in different diseases, like in COPD. We've got a paper in review. Actually, that one may have already been accepted. So that one will come out in a few months or something. But we'll do these kinds of analyses of how well does the algorithm predict downstream survival, or how does the algorithm predict their disease progression if it's a chronic disease. So there are all kinds of nuances to understanding how an algorithm can be useful.
I see. Yeah, that's awesome. Sorry. Yeah, go on.
So I think that's a great overview of what Arterys has done to really bring its integrated platform to be useful in other ways beyond what it was originally developed for. We started off doing, you can hear my kids in the background. We started off doing a lot of work in MRI and developing this technology for 4D flow MRI, which is a very, very advanced MRI technology. But this platform is so powerful, so useful. The ability to scale CPUs is just a general need that isn't available in most of the healthcare environments that we have. So in the background, when AI started to become of interest to Arterys, it became of interest to me, and I started to develop my own research lab at UCSD. This is one of my research residents who started playing around with the idea of highlighting different parts of an X-ray image with the areas affected by pneumonia. So stepping out of the bounding box idea or ROI idea and just colorizing the abnormalities. So we started playing with this idea of creating these probability maps or heat maps of abnormalities. And so we took that and just showed that you could train a UNet to do something like this with nice overlap with the ground truth. And this is something that everyone's doing now. One of the key points with AI is that you can really cheat your scores. You can cheat your AUROC by simply making your test cases really extreme, like the difference between normal and abnormal. right? Normal in your pathology. But in real life, in our clinical environment, we actually have quite a distribution of other diseases that aren't completely normal, but they may share some similar imaging characteristics, imaging features. So one of the things we did in one of our papers is just to highlight that, if you compare them against normal, we get a great AUC. If you compare against only other pathologies, you get a decent AUC. Real life is somewhere in between. So this is just something to know. When you're comparing AUCs, that they just doesn't capture the whole story. Anyway, so this algorithm was trained on external data that's just publicly available. Anyone can get access to it. The RSNA put a challenge together to detect pneumonia, and we basically used that data to create this algorithm. I think it consists of about 30,000 X-rays. With radiologist annotations, and that's available to anyone who wants to play with that, and that's a subset of a 102,000 X-ray data set released by the NIH a year or two before that. And we played with a couple different algorithms, like localizing endotracheal tubes and being able to predict, or not really predict, but in the machine learning terminology. Parlance of prediction is really just like showing what the machine is identifying as the tip of the endotracheal tube and the carina. So these are pretty straightforward algorithms to implement with the standard UNet. When COVID started to emerge out of China around December, January, and a few publications started to come out. This was one of the very first patients that was identified in Washington who had a series of X-rays who was found to have COVID. It was the first known case at the time of COVID-19. And what I asked my resident to do is take that algorithm that he already had, download the pictures, and just run it, see if the algorithm would work. And what it nicely showed is even in this really subtle pneumonia, it was able to pick up some hints of that viral pneumonia. So although we didn't train it with any knowledge, it's not like I foresaw the need of a COVID algorithm. I just wanted an algorithm to detect pneumonia to help our residents see it a little bit more easily.
So can I just sort of interrupt here?
Yeah.
So on day 6, did this patient have severe symptoms? So in terms of early detection, right? What can this do? Because I can see on day 3 there doesn't seem to be any detection, but it sort of jumps from day 5.
Yeah,
onwards.
I mean, as as a radiologist, I can actually already see abnormalities in day 3. I can see there's airspace opacity. So this initial algorithm, I don't want to say was great off the bat. It could see a fair amount of disease once it was more obvious. So what I saw immediately was this wasn't going to be an algorithm that was going to be highly sensitive for early detection, but it would be able to tell us which patients had a lot of involvement of the lungs versus a little bit of involvement of the lungs. And that was enough to do triage, right? If you have very little involvement, it's unlikely that patient's going to be in respiratory distress in that day or the next day. But if they already had a lot of involvement, those are the patients you need to bring into the hospital and follow more closely. And they tend to be sicker as well. So this was good confirmatory information. That's how X-ray is generally used. We use X-ray to triage. We're like, okay, is this patient really, really sick, or is this patient someone we can send home? And that's how we ended up using it. And this is a good example. These are 2 other patients who had obviously much more severe disease in developing what's called ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, and that's what COVID is known for. And these are the patients that require mechanical ventilation intubation.
I see.
So we ended up deploying this algorithm pretty quickly within sometime in March. I think just before that, in June, we're like, AI is great, but it's probably not going to be, reading all your X-rays like some people had said it would, but it is something that may be helpful. So we took it on. This is one of the very first patients sometime in March that got the AI algorithm run on it. And every X-ray, every chest X-ray that we run at UCSD is now run through a newer version of this AI algorithm, which I'll go into. But the initial algorithm, you can see that the radiologist overnight noticed there was some abnormality here up in the left upper lobes. He noticed probably an asymmetry, or he or she, I don't know, noticed an asymmetry up in the upper lobes. But what he or she failed to recognize was actually quite a bit involving the right middle lobe. There's a missing contour here of the right heart that an experienced radiologist would notice. As it turns out, the AI algorithm was able to pick that up, this very first version of the AI algorithm. And so that was quite confidence inspiring. How do you know this is real? Well, 4 days later, the same areas that were involved bloomed. So you know that this was all real, and you don't just have to take my word for it. That 4 days later, this is a patient who obviously is a lot sicker and needed to be hospitalized. So I'm obviously not very content with anything I ever see. People who work with me know this, that I'm always probing at the areas where it's not good enough. Nothing's ever good enough. My kids are, sorry.
Come on, Albert. Take it easy, Albert. Take it easy.
Yeah, they learn to live with it. But what we did anyway, despite the imperfections, we brought it out. We let our ER physicians see it and provide it to them with the hope that they might think of it favorably, even if I'm always critical. And we did a survey in the first month that it was deployed in that first wave of the pandemic. And we ended up doing about 202 surveys. This is led by our ER docs, actually, with 2,000 X-rays in that first month. What I was surprised to find, well, we made it pretty simple. This DICOM in, DICOM out. Basically we pump this X-ray image into the AI algorithm. It generates an X-ray image with color on it, and then they just look at it and see if it helps them. Was the user interface easy? Most people said yes, which I was happy to see. The residents were much more malleable. They thought it was very easy. Some of the attendings found it difficult to use. I'm surprised by that, but just shows you. Younger
Albert,
people
if you graph that with age, would there be a strong correlation there?
Probably. Residents are very young, right? They're fresh. They're used to learning new things. Having it somewhere on a different screen, or it's not hard. Scrolling your mouse to see it is not hard. But anyway, but what I was surprised by was a good fraction of the X-rays and color maps seemed to affect medical decision making, which was kind of like 20%. There are very few things in medicine that affect the clinical care 20% of the time. I wasn't even aware that X-rays affected the clinical management 20% of the time, let alone this color map. So that was a big shock. And so we also looked into, had them answer a third question: in what way did it affect their clinical management or clinical decision making? It may have affected the diagnostic testing, changed the final diagnostic in a fraction of the time, changed the treatment plan in a fraction of the time, changed the disposition, whether they got admitted to the hospital. And this was like a pretty crude version of the AI algorithm. I have to say that first version, in my opinion, wasn't very good, but it was, made an impact in a positive way. So what we did
I'm just going to interrupt you there for one more second. Sorry about that. So it seems like when it comes to the final decision making, that percentage is quite low. It doesn't look like a lot of physicians are, necessarily confident in how this result is helping them make that decision.
Well, I would take that in a little different way. There are many reasons why patients come to the emergency room, and it's not necessarily for COVID, right? Yeah. They may come in with shortness of breath, and it may be obviously because they're in heart failure.
Okay.
In which case, those patients, it doesn't matter what the X-ray shows. It's gonna almost always it's gonna be just heart failure and has nothing to do with pneumonia. And they're just doing the X-ray to confirm that it's not something else.
Yeah.
Right.
So following on that thought, I think what's also important is to understand that AI is not going to help you detect COVID. It's going to help you detect the symptoms, and those symptoms could be COVID or it could be something else, right?
Well, so yeah. I mean, I think you have to kind of look at it from the perspective of the patient and the doc, right?
Yeah.
So the patient comes in, all they know is they're short of breath.
Yeah.
Maybe their brother or sister had COVID, so there's a possibility that they have COVID, but they don't know, right? They haven't had the testing or anything, but they know they've had a previous heart attack.
Yeah.
So they don't know what's wrong with them. They're short of breath. They're coming into the emergency room. The doc that's seeing them is thinking the same thing, right? They're like, okay, well, what's your history? Okay, oh, you have heart disease, you have diabetes, and there's this pandemic that's raging around. Any of these things are possible. So we get an X-ray, try to figure out what the answer is. The COVID test, the RT-PCR may take 3 or 5 days, depending on where you're at. And so let's get an X-ray to see if there's obvious signs of viral pneumonia today. I can tell you right away or not. So when you ask the question, did this X-ray, did the color map affect your decision making? Yeah, it's not just about COVID. It's sort of like,
overall, yeah.
You have to ask, like, does 20% of the time is COVID even part of the question?
No,
so
makes sense.
So when you look at an intervention affecting management 20% of the time, it's quite shocking because there's so many variables, so many other indications, so many other things that are going on. And it may be abdominal pain, they'll get an X-ray, right?
Yeah.
So
that's true.
All right. So anyway, that's kind of a way of sort of figuring out how to interpret that data. From my standpoint, I'm not as interested in sort of the downstream triage elements. I want to optimize the algorithm. I want to make it better, right? So what we ended up doing was annotating about 1,000 X-rays and CT based on from patients who also had a CT on the same day, and then retrained it using transfer learning. We were able to get the performance to improve quite a bit and create a color map that was a little bit more indicative of what, in my mind's eye, I see, right? So the right middle lobe pneumonia in the same case, this is a more accurate representation of how much of the lung is actually involved. This is what I was hoping for. So I didn't annotate this case. This is all on just the test data, right? So we annotated other cases and we're able to improve the performance just by injecting this sort of radiology knowledge by painting some of these X-rays ourselves. So it really speaks to the need for us to, as practitioners, to see where these algorithms are falling a little bit short, and then tuning them to improve them to where we expect them to be. Now this can be a good way of communicating, right? Like I can say this is pretty much the amount and area of lung that I see affected. So I can teach a resident based on this X-ray, what do you see, right? And then I say, well, there's actually, this is the area of pneumonia you should be seeing, right? And this could also be available to them if they aren't able to see it. So this is a different example, and just to give a little bit more of a clinical perspective of how patients sort of present and how X-rays are being used. This is a patient who presented with nasal congestion, a little bit of cough, a little bit of sweats, wasn't short of breath. And it happened that his RT-PCR became positive from his sample on day 0. Now, those samples take a couple days, so they didn't have the result back right away. There's a rapid test that's a little bit faster, but it's not very accurate. Anyway, so he was discharged home for self-isolation, and then he came back on day 4. Now, at this point, he's short of breath, right? This is pretty indicative. This is pretty common. When you have this much lung involved, they do tend to be short of breath. And so this is a good use of X-ray, right? You can confirm that the shortness of breath isn't because of something else. It's not because he's in pulmonary edema from heart failure or something like that. This is from the viral pneumonia. This is also a pattern that's really classic for COVID. So any radiologist that's reading X-rays now, they see this X-ray, they're probably like, oh, it's probably COVID. Right? Yeah. So as it turns out, the updated algorithm is just much more confident in that. So I feel like we've done a decent job at improving that algorithm. And there are many other diseases that we want to address in clinical care. Pneumonia is just one of many.
So just an interruption here. So one of the questions that's sort of related to this that's come up is COVID pneumonia different from normal pneumonia by just visual inspection?
Yeah, I mean, there are many kinds of pneumonia, right? There's bacterial pneumonia, so they can be infectious. Pneumonia that's caused by often getting a cold, and then a bacteria then grow, and then you end up with a prolonged illness like a month, and the bacteria grow in that area that was affected by the initial viral infection.
Yep.
So COVID pneumonia is a little bit different in that COVID directly attacks the lungs. So in the immediate phase, initial phase of the infection, it's actually already affecting the lungs. That's why you see these like patchy opacities here. The virus is actually attacking the lungs directly, which you don't usually get from a lot of the other viral infections. It's less common. So anyway, that sort of speaks to that. But you can also have pneumonia from non-infectious causes. You can have the lung being injured from things like vaping, or things like autoimmune infection, autoimmune inflammation rather, and autoimmune disease. So those things can injure the lungs as well. And that's part of our job as radiologists, is to try to discriminate between them. And I'll show you a few images of other diseases as well. Okay, so I think that's the last slide of this. What Arterys has nicely done is give us a mechanism to bring in AI into our clinical environment. This just happens to be a viewer which we can drag in the results and quickly navigate through the X-rays on, and this is kind of a common sort of interface that we'll use that has some different tools for window leveling, adjusting the contrast, so that we can look at the lungs, look behind the diaphragm, look behind the heart. This is another patient with COVID, for example. And then the color maps certainly also appear here. This is the second version of the pneumonia algorithm that is now in our clinical environment. Also does some quantification on X-ray on the amount of lung involved. Just to sort of touch on the point you raised, Nawan, this is a different patient with who is a young patient. Initially, when I saw it, without the CT, of course, I looked at it and I was like, well, this could be COVID. There's also this thing called pneumomediastinum, where the airways have ruptured and the gas is leaking in the chest cavity around the heart. So you can see that on the CT scan here. When I first saw it, I was like, oh, it's probably just COVID, right? And then it turns out its COVID tests were negative, and I was like, well, the other possibility is that it's a different kind of lung injury. And before COVID happened, it was actually widely publicized, EVALI, vaping-associated lung injury, e-cigarette vaping. That's what this turned out to be. This young man had been vaping quite a bit in his free time. So the CT scans, so the relationship between CT and X-rays is essentially, they're looking at the same thing. They're both using X-ray, but one has three-dimensional resolution, and you get cross sections on. But they basically represent the same disease.
So just to follow up on that, how, like, in looking at this, like, how dangerous then does that mean? Like, how dangerous is this for this person in the future in terms of what other kind of symptoms they might develop because of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you get lung injury that's diffuse, you know, people have quite a bit of reserve. So if you take out a lung, for example, you can do a pneumonectomy. People can survive. They can live on one lung. A lot of people do, actually. Or if you have lung cancer, they'll take out a lobe, maybe not a whole lung. So you can lose a good fraction of your lung without being symptomatic at rest. The problem is that if you try to exercise, if you're expecting to be a marathon runner, you may not have as much reserve to be able to take you to those extreme physical limits as somebody with two lungs.
Yeah.
So this patient may long term not have the same maximal physical ability as somebody else who didn't have this lung injury. So, but if he's going to just sit at home and vape all day for the next 30 years, then I guess that's not a big deal. So, all right. So anyway, I think that's all I really wanted to show. I don't know if other people have questions or anything.
So one of the questions that sort of came up was that so where did you find, so you mentioned the data set source, but if you can talk about the data set source, again, which you used to essentially do the detection for pneumonia. You said it was an open source data set?
Yeah, so there are some quite a few open source data sets now. That's I guess a very popular initiative amongst radiology groups now. There was another one recently, the RSNA, the big radiology society of North America. It has been releasing large data sets with multiple hospitals from around the world contributing. So there was another large CT data set that was just released with, I don't know, 1 million images or something by the RSNA for helping to provide data out there so people can develop algorithms for detection of pulmonary emboli, which ironically is one of the problems that John and I discussed when we were first starting Arterys. I think he's like, oh, would it be useful to detect pulmonary emboli? I'm like, nah, we can do that. It's pretty easy. Humans can do that fine. As it turns out, now it's just so easy to develop algorithms. I think it's not out of reach to do all of these things now. So anyway, so there's a big data set out there for that. There's obviously this pneumonia data set. There's data set for bone age. There's a data set for any number of diseases now for people to play with. I think there's still a long distance between the public data sets and clinical utility.
Yeah.
Clinical utility means you got to handle all the nuances, and there's just a lot there. You just won't see them until it's in your hands in practice.
So I have another question for John. So as Albert was talking about these nuances, right? Like when you talk to various clients or customers of yours, where do those nuances fit in? Like where do they come from? What kind of challenges do you face?
Are you saying more on the AI side or more on like the deployment or just broadly?
I mean, so what tends to happen is that as you're developing these algorithms, that like one of the plots that Albert showed was that, okay, if you're just taking two cases, right? In case of UNET, you're just taking like whether this person has pneumonia or not, versus if they have other diseases, right? So how often do these situations sort of come up, right? Because you have to then retrain your AI system in order to account for this in some way or the other, right?
Yeah. I think what you're describing is maybe what's going to happen in 10, 20 years from now. Like, honestly, what's happening now is like people are creating like a very, very narrow, algorithms to do very specific things. And to your point, like you deploy it and there's all sorts of ways it's failing across the board. And at the end of the day, it's how in the case where it fails, how can you minimally disrupt that workflow? So I think if it's failing where it's where you can easily edit the result in order to say, this is not pneumonia, and then feed it back. That's where our goal is. It's like, yes, in the case where everything works great, fantastic, but it needs to be smooth and non-intrusive when it fails. And so that's where I spend a lot of my time, and our customers ask for it. It's like, hey, like make it easy to edit, or hey, don't even show it to me if it's wrong, or like things like that. And then again, they're very narrow. Like these algorithms are detecting pathology by pathology. In the case of X-ray, it's like 7 pathologies, and we have to track performance in each one of these specific areas. There's 1,000 things that you can flag in an X-ray. So we're just like scratching the surface of what we can do. Yeah.
So I think one of the wonderful things about this whole, this whole endeavor between you and Albert was the fact that you guys were able to deploy the AI model extremely quickly, right? So can you tell us a little bit about that whole process that took place, and that whole journey?
Yeah. So and then I'll let Albert chime in, but that's kind of the unique part of what we built and what we're trying to do is I want to make it so that it takes less than an hour to deploy an update. And Albert's already provided, 10 updates to the model, and he updates it on a weekly or even daily basis. That could never work in a production like PACS environment, in a clinical environment. It's like, to give you a sense of order of magnitude, to update to the next version of a PACS at a health system, it takes thousands of people hours, thousands. And we're trying to disrupt that. We want to make it so that it's just like seconds. And so we have an SDK, we have a way to plug in these updates to make it extremely efficient. I want to get so that it's self-serve. We're not there yet. It still takes like 30 minutes of our time to update Albert's model, which is still disruptive for the developer who's focused on other things. Yeah. So, but it takes effort to get it to be self-serve. And one day we'll get there. I don't know, Albert, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's key. I think that there's obviously a huge interest amongst radiologists to really develop AI algorithms to serve their own needs. We have many. We're doing a lot of really repetitive tasks that we know we shouldn't be. And in certain areas, especially like cardiac imaging, we're measuring things by hand, drawing circles. It's just torture, and we don't want to be doing that. And so there's definitely a lot of initiatives amongst radiologists to develop our own AI algorithms. And so I think when we deployed it, even when I was in training, one of my co-residents developed this amazing metal artifact reduction algorithm, which is brilliant. And it lasted for a few years. It took a long time to get online. And then as soon as he left, it kind of went away and nobody could bring it back. I think that's a common occurrence. Like we're all like tinkerers by nature, and we're smart people. We're interested in new technology. So that's what got us into radiology. So I think there's definitely, this really does fill that gap, that need. But for us to be able to do this in practice, historically it was impossible, almost impossible. You get one algorithm up in a four-year period, maybe, Yeah. But what I'm aiming to do at UCSD is to have about a dozen algorithms from my lab and other labs around on our campus deployed into our clinical environment. That would have been unheard of years ago, maybe still unheard of in most places, but we're planning on doing that.
So sort of a follow-up on that, you mentioned that you're still making hand measurements, right? Or in radiology, in certain domains, they're still doing this. Have they tried using sort of traditional computer vision algorithms to solve these problems?
Oh yeah, it's so hard though.
It's so hard. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just take a look at how easy deep learning is compared to everything else. It's just like night and day, right? Like, yeah.
I mean, but you still need to annotate things, right? So.
Yeah, that's the easy part.
I will say it's easy for like from a clinician's perspective, but like from our perspective, like to get good ground truth and consensus, it's hard. And for some problems, like there is no strong consensus. Like if you want to segment the prostate on MR, it's just like there's no clear boundary. And so like that's just problem is in and of itself so hard. To say whether it's pneumonia or not, a binary classifier, fine, but like it's loss segmentation task. It's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that also speaks to where the expertise is. You know, radiologists can do that pretty easily, but a company hiring a whole staff of experts can have difficulty doing that. So I think that it also solves that problem. We're willing to do it for ourselves, but you know, it's pricey to hire a radiologist to do it.
Yeah. I'm sure, and also it's also a time drain, right? Like, I mean, if you have annotated data, you can very, very quickly train a deep learning algorithm. But when you have to annotate it, make sure that, and especially if it's something like a timescale that COVID is on, you want to move as quickly as possible. You want to annotate data. You want to train a system and deploy it as soon as possible. So what's actually wonderful is you guys were able to repurpose an existing model and serve that, which is honestly like super impressive. So so one of the other questions that we got is, and you guys have sort of answered this, but you can perhaps expand on this, is that is there a specific AI algorithm designed to detect COVID pneumonia, or can it differentiate between different types of pneumonia? So,
yeah, I mean that can certainly be done. It's really a data problem, right? Like one example, one way that I could do that if I thought it was important would be just to take all the pneumonias that were diagnosed, COVID pneumonias that were diagnosed since March, and then take all the pneumonias that were diagnosed before 2020, and then you could make a classifier or something like that. And I think that would do a decent job. As it turns out, it's an okay problem, but it's not like mission critical. Like I said, it's like it's not so much about whether it's COVID or not, as much as it is about how much is involved, how much of the lung is involved. That's why I've sort of focused the algorithm on quantification rather than discrimination. But they're both solvable problems. It's just a matter of what data you use and what you're trying to solve. But I from the clinical perspective, from my own use, I would favor just being able to measure how much of the lung is involved and then be able to prognosticate that way.
So this sort of leads me to another question. So are there other symptoms apart from pneumonia that you can detect from the X-rays? Or is there any other aspects that you can utilize to detect COVID?
Well, so one thing to sort of think about, I guess maybe to back up about COVID, is it's a respiratory-borne illness. Also gastrointestinal. You can get it from eating stuff, and we actually even have at UCSD the sewers are actually monitored for COVID because people shed the virus in the sewers, and that's actually how we can prevent it from spreading across the dorms. And we have a very low rate apparently of that because we have this early detection. It actually gets shed before patients are symptomatic. So obviously, if you're taking an X-ray of the lungs, you're not looking at the rest of the body, right? Like you're not looking up in the airways, up in the head and neck. You're only looking at the lungs. So some patients have their infection in the nasopharynx up here. That's not going to be in your X-ray, nor could we see it even if we did X-ray that area. And other people have the infection in their lungs. Other people have infection in their gut. So there's what's called a biodistribution. The virus can be in different places.
I see.
So I think the mainstay of diagnosis of the infection will be the RT-PCR from the blood, because that's the most likely to really be sensitive for it, and I don't see that changing. But the key for the imaging is to see how much of the lungs are affected, because that determines whether or not you need to go to the ICU or you probably can go home.
I see. So John, on your end, what are the next steps with this whole project? How are you guys going to take it forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's It depends on priority from our side. We're happy to share what Albert is doing with other health systems.
Yeah.
From a commercial perspective, if we were to sell it commercial, we need to get regulatory clearance. It becomes a priority thing. And also, it's not just, oh, we're going to do it just for sake. It's like it has to be tied to an actual commercial or a business opportunity. And so we have to weigh that with all the other applications that could have maybe a stronger ROI. So ultimately, people are buying AI not because it's nice or it's all about what is the financial return on that investment that I'm going to make. So we have to prioritize that. So right now it's like it's not high because it's not there's higher priority initiatives. But I think as this disease evolves, I think it can become an opportunity. That's the worst word to use. Something where people see value in being able to quantify this over time. So I think more to come.
Yeah, I think the reality is there are now, as you can see, dozens, hundreds, thousands of people developing different AI algorithms, and they're all somewhat niche in a way, right? Like they're solving a specific problem, has to be matched with the people who actually want to use that for their purposes. So it's hard to know like what will generate revenue at the end of the day, right? Like that's kind of the bottom line for John and the team is what's going to generate revenue for the company. And for sure, what is needed is the infrastructure to be able to deploy the AI algorithm. Less certain which specific applications. But that's fine. From my standpoint, I just want the algorithms that I'm developing because I know they're important for me and for our institution. I don't know yet how important they are for other people. Hard to know.
And I'm sure there are other algorithms that for other diseases which can be deployed, and they can essentially, like, you can use the platform in order to essentially run inference and use that for diagnosis and various things, right? So that's something that is easily possible.
Yeah.
Right? So
and so if I have colleagues somewhere else, it's already running in the cloud. It's not like they can't use the same algorithm.
They can use the same algorithm, and
so
it's almost, in some ways, you can create a marketplace of algorithms ultimately, and then you can use that to essentially serve for specific use cases, right? So that's awesome. So one of the other questions that we have is, what happens if a patient with a severe respiratory disease like COPD, COVID, contracts COVID? Does the pre-existing COVID condition impede the accuracy of AI function in such a patient?
No, so these are important questions. I would say COPD probably has little, having COPD probably doesn't really affect this particular algorithm, but there are certain diseases that share very similar characteristics that also can coexist. So one of the things that I noticed with this algorithm is that patients with pulmonary edema from heart failure look almost identical to my eye, to a lot of people's eyes. And so we'll sometimes, even interpreting the x-rays, misclassify patients with pulmonary edema as being COVID or vice versa. Oh, it's just pulmonary edema, and it turns out it's COVID. I think that's a reality, right? Like there are certain diseases that are going to have overlapping appearances, and so you can train specifically for that, and that's one task that we want to do next.
So have you tried training something like an ensemble model to deal with these sorts of situations?
Yeah, that's one of the strategies. Yeah.
Okay. And has that worked well? Doesn't work, or what are the challenges you face?
Yeah, I mean that's in process. I think the truth is pulmonary edema is a challenging problem on its own. So we have to play. Put a few tricks into the game in order to get that to work before we ensemble. But that's a great idea.
Yeah. Awesome. So on your end, John, like how as you're scaling this whole thing, right? Like, I mean, how many like as you create a marketplace, right? Like what are some of the challenges that you think you'll face in terms of how many people, is there a limit of how many kind of models you can host and how many people can work with it? Or is that just an engineering problem?
Yeah, no, I would say it's not even an engineering problem. Like that's kind of bread and butter in terms of what we've developed. But I think the biggest challenge could come to in adoption. It's like and showing that clinical evidence that it is impacting outcomes and ROI. And like from an engineering perspective, like it's super easy to scale. You just spin up more servers.
Yeah.
You can spin up more customers. Like it's all parallelized. That is like the last thing I worry about. What's really the thing that keeps you up at night is how is that impacting care? And quantifying that, because people can say it, but you got to show the results. So that's what keeps me up at night.
And then the hospital administrations, the radiologists, everyone engaged in clinical care has to believe you, and then buy into it and then purchase it, right? Like I think there are a lot of players involved. It's not easy for any of these algorithms.
So you guys must have engaged with a lot of regulators, right? Like what is their take on it? Because I was seeing the other day there was an article by what was it? Was it by the CDC or the FDA or someone about like how to deploy an AI model for purposes of clinical trials? I think that was the use case that they were putting out there. So, like, how do they react to all of this?
Yeah, I mean, there's very clear guidance on what is required to get algorithms or software cleared. The first step is identifying what is the level of risk of that algorithm, and that tells you what class it's in, and then based on what class, it shows you whether you can use a predicate device to and just match its specs, or have like a standalone clinical assessment, clinical trial. So like that's all really, really clear. And from an AI perspective, the FDA doesn't care about AI. It's at the end of the day, it's about proving that the software is safe and effective. And so you can treat it like a black box in a way, but ultimately it's like if you document it well, you can get through the FDA. So it's a very straightforward process, but it takes time, right? Like just running the assessments takes years if you want to collect a lot of data.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the bar for making claims for marketing is fairly high. I mean, it's not cheap to go through that process of FDA clearance.
I'm sure, because this affects people's lives, right? I mean, if anything goes wrong, then whom do you blame?
At the individual physician level, we can use these algorithms, we can develop them, but ultimately at the end of the day, the diagnosis is still in the hands of the physician. So it kind of doesn't really change that workflow. But the FDA is obviously trying to prevent people from selling things that are marketed as one thing but don't have any evidence behind it.
So that makes sense. Awesome. So with that, I would like to close the event. So firstly, thank you to both our speakers. You guys did an awesome job of presenting what you guys have done. And in this event, we learned how we can create these sorts of scalable platforms, especially to tackle really emerging problems. So if there's a next pandemic tomorrow, make sure you contact John to deploy the AI models, and make sure you contact Albert to develop the models, work with John to do this sort of thing. But I think this is a really good example of how you can have a sort of academia industry collaboration, and you can move things forward. And COVID has ravaged not just this country, but all over the world. It's claimed a lot of lives. And it's important to know that using these sorts of systems that as we're developing them, we can help solve a lot of these problems. So thank you, both of you. You guys were awesome. And thanks for our attendees for coming today and for asking the questions. And I'm really glad that everyone came. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you, John, Albert. Thank you for your work. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thanks for
much.
inviting us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.